to the Two-Ton Nerds. As always, my name is Max James, and this is Let's Watch True Blood, a series retrospective of all 70 episodes of the series. And in this video, I'll be talking about the episode Mine. It takes place right after the last episode where Sookie's being surrounded by the three vampires who answer Bill's door, and they kind of glamour her, and it doesn't work, and they're taken by that. And they kind of have the same reaction that Bill had in the cemetery when he found out he couldn't glamour her. And it's a funny scene in a way, because one of the vampires kind of has this dumbfounded look on his head. It's the same one you see in Maudette's videotape of the vampire who she has sex with, and it's quite funny. He's actually a pretty funny vampire. I mean, not because he's funny looking, just his motions and his reactions and the way he kind of says stuff is kind of funny. I wish they wouldn't have done what they did with him, but I'll get more into that later. But as she's kind of walking around in Bill's apartment, Bill's kind of revealed in the shadows, sitting in the chair, kind of very Bond villainish. You don't see his face, and the three vampires kind of grab onto her and reveal that she smells so sweet, and I mean, she kind of gives off this aroma, and they reveal that baby's blood is better than her blood, just barely, and it's like, oh man, they're very vicious. And then that's where Bill does his infamous lines like, "Sookie is mine." And they just back off like, alright. And throughout the episode, they kind of get in little heated arguments. And nothing too serious, but nothing. And when one of them's like, "Oh, here's Jerry," one of the people that the vampires feed off of, and it's like, "Here, Bill, have a taste of him." And he's about to bite him on the neck, and as Sookie always does, listens to his thoughts, and reveals that he has hepatitis D, a blood virus that only affects vampires, that makes him weak for about 2 months, and it just basically just makes him weak. And they immediately get all like, "Oh dear God, we need to get out of here." And so they take off with Jerry and the other person who they were feeding off of, and so they went off, and Sookie got really upset about how Bill proclaimed that Sookie is his, and so she drives off, and Bill meets Sookie back at her house and has one of the best written dialogue scenes in the entire show, running the show so far. I have not seen this last season, so because as of this recording, it hasn't aired. They talk about how she's like, "How do you even breathe and digest blood and just everything else, and what's keeping you alive?" And he's like, "It's magic," and she kind of throws it off like, no, it's not magic. But Bill says this really cool lines like, "Just because you know how the mechanics of everything that works, doesn't make it any less than magic. And it just, your magic is different than my magic." And it's a really cool scene of just these two talking, and I really liked it a lot. And throughout the episode, between Bill and Sookie, that the vampire blood still is within Sookie's blood, and her libido is kind of in full force, and she's starting to have dreams about Bill, and the sunlight is kind of like more intensified and very how do I want to put it? I can't think of a word. It's very, I can't think of a word right now. I really can't. It's intensified in a good way, and that's where their story arc kind of ends for a little bit then, because most of this episode is focused on the secondary stars. And what I mean by secondary, I don't mean that in a bad way. I really don't. It's just, they're just second to Bill and Sookie. And so it means these follows Dawn, Tara, Sam, and Jason, and Lafayette throughout this episode. Let's start with Tara. Tara, she doesn't want to go home. She's working at Merlotte's now because of her alcoholic mother. And so she kind of bides her time before she actually really has to go home and deal with what's waiting for her at home. So her and Sam kind of start to drink on his porch, and they kind of get into kind of very personal territory and conversation wise, and they end up in bed together. And that's when she finally has to go home and deal with what her mother is at home, and she ends up getting hit over the head with a whiskey bottle, and that's like, oh, I'm done, I'm moving out, this is end of this road for me. And then it cuts to Jason and Dawn. Their relationship is starting to really burn up in flames like she predicted, and because he failed to perform in bed, and he's starting to kind of take it very personally. So that's where he kind of makes into Lafayette, and Lafayette is kind of like the drug kingpin of of Shreveport, Bonton, and it's quite hilarious because he's like wearing gold pants, and Jason kind of mentions that. It's a funny sequence. It's like, you're wearing gold pants, and it's quite funny. And so that's where the V juice kind of comes back into it again, and that really reveals that Lafayette is a V juice dispenser. And he's like, this cannot get out because vampires do not take kindly to this. And so that's where Jason's story arc for this episode kind of disappears. Then Sam comes back into the picture and is like, hey, we dropped by Dawn's. She didn't show up for work, so Sookie kind of goes by and opens the door and reveal her alarm clock is just still blaring. And then Dawn is dead on her bed. And it ends with Sookie screaming, as quite a few episodes do. And it's really funny because True Blood's cliffhangers for the next episode are always great and they end on a very high note. So, that's really it for this episode. The high point of this episode is obviously the dialogue scene between Sookie and Bill about her magic versus his magic in terms of how the body works, and it's a really cool sequence of dialogue in between those two. And so that's really it for this episode of called Mine, and my name is Max James, and I'm going to go geek out.